Thank you, Brendan O'Connor. Appreciate your time. With me now, I have the Parliamentary Secretary for Trade and Foreign Affairs, Steve Ciobo. Steve Ciobo, first to you on the higher education reforms. Vicky Thompson from the Group of Eight says she still backs the government's plan, deregulation, but she does, and the Group of Eight warning they don't want it watered down any further.
Well, look, I mean, you've summarised it succinctly, Kieran. The fact is that the Group of Eight still make it clear, as indeed does pretty much the entirety of the tertiary sector, make it clear that the government's proposed reforms are the only thing that provides certainty in relation to funding for the tertiary sector in this country. Now, unfortunately, because of the crossbench and in the main the Labor Party, we're left with a situation where we do not know what the future for tertiary education is going to be. The sector is flying blind, and it's flying blind because of the obstinance by the Labor Party and elements of the crossbench.
So will the government consider this review? I know Mr Pyne's saying that there's no plans to undertake a review, but it seems from the Group of Eight they believe now that that is necessary to reboot the situation essentially and look for some bipartisanship with the ALP.
Well, if you want to reboot the situation, the easiest way to do that would be to get the Labor Party to actually display some semblance of common sense and to actually put the national interest first instead of their own short-term political interest. The reason why this isn't happening is because Labor has said they could not care less about what the impact of their policy obstinance is going to be on the tertiary sector. What we have outlined is a clear plan that provides stability and certainty to tertiary education in Australia. We've got the backing of the Group of Eight. We've got the backing of something like 35 out of 36 universities across the country. And what we don't have, though, is the Australian Labor Party willing to put aside their short-term political opportunism. Now, we've had something like 30 reviews in the past 20 or 50 years or something like that. And I don't think another review is actually necessarily going to be the best step forward.
On the tax review, the tax discussion paper, Steve Ciobo, is this superannuation idea of cracking down on exemptions for the wealthy, the area of bipartisanship necessary for at least a start in tax reform?
Well, we've made it clear that there will be no detrimental changes to superannuation in this term of the Parliament. We made that crystal clear before the last election, and we're following through on that, honouring our commitment that there would be no detrimental changes. But I'd make this point, Kieran. This so-called consensus view that there needs to be a crackdown on superannuation concessions for the wealthy, frankly, in my view, is complete rubbish. The fact is that these are people who are providing for their own retirement. It is a very small minority of people who have very large sums in their superannuation, a very small percentage. It's nickel and dime stuff in the grand scheme of things. The reality is that we need to make sure that when it comes to superannuation, we have policy settings that are going to provide in the long term the kind of incentive for Australians to provide for their own retirement, because we need Australians to provide for their own retirements as much as possible, and we need to incentivise them into the system, because if we don't, those people will be reliant on taxpayer support in the form of a pension or a part pension, which is going to make all of our expenditure problems even more significant in future years.
But Mr Hockey did indicate that the coalition was open to reform in this area with the white paper to take into the 2016 election. He did indicate that the government was willing to look at this yesterday.
Well, we've made it clear that there clearly needs to be reform in relation to super and in relation to tax. We are taking these forward because obviously the taxation treatment of superannuation is the single biggest driver of the way in which people provide for their own retirement. Now, we're taking this forward as a discussion with the Australian people. We want Australians to have their say. They've got until the 1st of June to make a contribution in relation to the Rethink paper, which is the tax white paper. So we're calling on all Australians to have their say in relation to that, and of course major groups will play a key advocacy role in relation to tax policy in Australia. So, we welcome the dialogue. We're going to take ideas to the next election that will help to put Australia on a long-term sustainable pathway.
But you don't think it's this idea of taxing the wealthy on the treatment of their superannuation, the tax treatment, is a silver bullet to some great savings?
Kieran, it's very easy for the Australian Labor Party and the Greens to run around and say how outraged they are that there's Australians with significant amounts of money in their superannuation and how this demonstrates that the system's failing. Complete and utter rubbish. Complete and utter rubbish. The fact is that there is a very tiny number of Australians who have been able to amass money in their superannuation, but that's not the story of the problem here. The story of the problem here is that we have a lot of Australians who are putting, ordinary Australians, putting ordinary wages into their superannuation, and what we need to make sure we do is we provide further incentive for Australians to provide for their own retirement, because if we don't do that, then our expenditure problems through the pension are going to become even more significant than they are today.
Mr. Ciobo, as always, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Pleasure.